new look. New PowerPoint, new systems. Okay, so in the next couple of lessons, mini lessons, you're going to see a couple of new systems that we're going to talk about. So much to talk about in the animal organization unit, right? Okay, so you might be sick of me talking because sometimes, your teacher sits in front of the class and they're like, blah, 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 blah. But, I'm on a computer, so same thing. I'm gonna be showing you guys quite a few videos to kind of sum some things up. I will obviously tell you about all the stuff that I want to tell you about and inform you about, but you'll hear some other things with some videos. So, in saying that, let's start our first video. So we're going to talk about the nervous system. So here's kind of an overview, and then I will follow it up with all of my lovely details. Aren't you excited? you guys a good start. Now, let me follow that up with a bunch of details. I'm not going to try and be too lengthy, but the nervous system, okay, the function controls how your body works and responds. I mean, ultimately, everything that we do from, using our muscles to sensing different things in the environment is all due to our nervous system, okay? So the main components of the nervous system, you have the central nervous system, which sometimes we call CNS. That's the brain and the spinal cord, okay? So anytime you're asked what's the central nervous system, that's it, the brain, the spinal cord, okay? The peripheral nervous system is all the other nerves coming off of the spinal cord, okay? So all of those nerves that branch off. So obviously this picture is the central nervous system. You have the brain and the spinal cord. Now if you saw a picture of all those neurons and those nerves that branch off, that's the peripheral nervous system, okay? Now the neuron is the smallest unit of the nervous system, okay? It's one cell. And it's a very interesting, unique cell, okay? Many of these cells together make up a nerve, which we can see, but a neuron itself is actually microscopic, okay? So all of these kind of bundled together make up a nerve fiber. So this particular cell does not regenerate. Most of our cells are constantly, creating new cells. There's new growth, but basically, your neurons, your nerve cells, are once for a lifetime. Okay, so that's why it's so important to protect our spinal cord and all of the nerves. If we have any kind of nerve damage, typically you do not get movement or you don't regain any of that, whatever you severed. So I have a friend who we were in an accident with some jet skis, and he basically had some nerve damage in his arm and does not have full ability in his hand anymore. I would say about 90%, but still there's some bit that he will never regain because that's nerve damage, okay? Now something about the neuron, okay, that there's an electrical impulse that we're going to talk about. Okay, this electrical impulse travels through this neuron, and what starts off in these dendrites, these little finger-like projections. So the nerve impulse kind of enters through here. This is the cell body, this is the nucleus right here. And that nerve impulse will run this direction only and always, okay? It never comes in from this direction and goes out. It always comes in from the dendrites, runs along what we call the axon, all the way to the axon terminals, okay? At the end of the axon terminals, you either reach another neuron or you reach kind of an effector organ or gland. So say for instance this is a muscle on the end here, and this neuron is sending an electrical impulse to say move your hand from that hot surface, okay? So basically it'll go through this direction, affect this muscle, and you'll pull your hand away, okay? There's a lot of different components to this neuron. I'm not going to be testing you guys on anything super specific, so I'm not going to go over each one of these things in depth, but it's very interesting, and there's so much to talk about when we talk about the nervous system and especially the brain. So I apologize that I can't go into super great detail, because otherwise you'd be listening to me for like 2 hours, and I don't know if you really want to do that. So let's keep going. Classification of neurons. There are different types of neurons. We have something called a multipolar. They have 3 or more processes off of the cell body. Most common in humans, these are found in the central nervous system. So here's a cell body. You have not only these dendrites, but you also have these 2 axons. So that's a multipolar neuron, okay? They have 3 or more processes off of the cell body. Okay, you have a bipolar neuron, which only have 2. So you have this axon and basically 1 dendrite. 2 processes off the cell body, bipolar, very rare in adults. You'll see these a lot in children, but as children grow, they will start to, and that's another thing, is as you grow and as you learn more, it's not necessarily like your brain gets bigger. You know what actually happens is you start to grow more dendrites. The more dendrites you have, the more connections you have in your brain, and the more electrical impulses are being sent to different parts of the brain and sending different impulses. So the more you're learning right now, as you're gaining all of this amazing information, your dendrites are growing. Okay, so it doesn't mean you get a bigger brain, but the more information that you have in that noggin of yours, the more dendrites you have on your neurons, okay? So as a young child, your neurons might look like this, but as you start to learn, your dendrites start to grow, okay? So that's why these are rare in adults. Unless you don't, if you choose not to do your schoolwork, maybe your neurons look like this. No, just kidding. Anyways, okay. And then unipolar. these only have one single process. So here's the cell body, and this is actually considered one single process off of that cell body. These are found in the peripheral nervous system. Okay, so that's where you're going to see those unipolar neurons. Okay, and then three kinds of neurons. So basically, we talked about kind of the classification of neurons, but we have different types of neurons that do different things. Okay, so what we do is we put them according to what direction they travel, the impulse travel, should I say. Remember, you have that electrical impulse that's traveling along that neuron. So a sensory neuron carries impulses from the sense organs to the spinal cord and brain. So take, for instance, you have your ear. You're hearing the phone ring, right? Here's the phone. Bring, bring. Okay? Although we don't have phones like that really anymore. Okay? And your ear and all the nerves, as you know, we talked about the senses, how those sound waves go through your ear and reach the eardrum, cause the vibrations along those three lovely little tiny bones over to the oval window and so forth, and it sends a message, okay, through this sensory neuron. The sensory neuron takes that impulse towards the brain and spinal cord. So all sensory neurons take that impulse to the brain and spinal cord. So it's going to the brain, okay, that direction. All right, then you have a motor neuron, okay? A motor neuron carries impulses from the brain and spinal cord to muscles and glands. So then I'll talk about what happens in between, but basically this is a motor neuron. Carries an impulse from the brain that then affects either a muscle or a gland, okay? Let me talk about an interneuron, and then I'll come back to this picture and explain everything. The interneuron connects that sensory and the motor neuron, okay, and carries that impulse in between them. So in the brain, you have the interneurons that basically interpret the message coming from the sensory neuron, and then also send an impulse to this motor neuron. So it's the kind of the in-between, okay? So you have this impulse that travels along the sensory neuron to the brain and spinal cord. The brain interprets it through an interneuron. The interneuron sends an impulse to the motor neuron, which then causes a muscle or a gland to act on that, okay? So you hear it, sends a signal to the brain, says, I hear the phone, you better pick it up, sends an impulse through the motor neuron, the hand goes and picks up the phone. Blam, okay? Calling it good. If you don't understand it, rewind and listen again. Maybe you'll get it. Or ask me. Okay, now, transmission of an impulse. Here's where we get really technical. You're going to learn a lot of this when you get to college biology, and it's very in-depth. So I apologize if I lose you, but I want to go over it because you're going to see it in your unit if you're reading through, which you should be, and taking notes. But you need to know a little bit of this, but I'm not going to be testing you heavily. Really, I don't even know if there's a single question on the actual transmission of an impulse, but know some of these key terms that I talk about. So what is an impulse? Okay, not the impulse to shop, not one of those kind of impulses, okay, so not like that. An impulse is basically the electrical impulse that goes through your neurons and causes some kind of an action. So let's talk about the resting potential, because here's what we need to understand and kind of grasp at some point. You need to understand that everything in our bodies has a lot to do with electrical impulses and a voltage, like basically charges. We have a charge in our body, and different things happen when these electrical charges change. So a neuron has an electrical potential or a voltage across its cell membrane. So this is a neuron, okay? Say this is the axon, that long kind of skinny thing. So this is the axon, and you have a positive charge on the outside of the cell membrane and a negative charge on the inside. Well, all of a sudden you have this stimulus, okay? So say you feel a breeze outside, okay? That will stimulate a neuron that senses that from your skin, and it's going to send an impulse to the brain to interpret that, okay? But in order to send that impulse, you have to change this electrical potential here. So what happens is as this impulse travels along this neuron, you have this influx of potassium, which is K, and sodium that changes, basically diffuses out. You have more potassium that rushes into the cell membrane, and then the sodium rushes out and causes this change in the resting potential, okay? And that's where that impulse moves along. So let's see if you guys can kind of grasp this. Again, if you don't freak out. I'm not going to be testing you on this. So this is caused by a pump in the cell membrane that pumps sodium ions out of the cell and potassium ions in. So potassium has a overall plus charge on it. Sodium has a negative charge. So in order to change this resting potential of positive on the outside, negative on the inside, you have this pump, the sodium potassium ion pump that pumps these in and changes it to positive on the inside and negative on the outside, okay? As you do that, the electrical impulse is traveling along that axon, okay? So that's what's happening with that pump. So because the potassium ions tend to leak out of the cell, there's an overall negative charge on the inside of the cell, okay? That's kind of the resting. So an impulse causes a movement of ions across the cell membrane, like I talked to you about. So when you have this impulse, it's going to cause that change in the charges, okay? So an impulse begins when a neuron is stimulated by another neuron or the environment, just like I told you with the wind or with another neuron. It's stimulated, and that nerve impulse now wants to travel down that neuron, okay? So the sodium channels are going to open up, and those sodium, those Na, are going to flow into the cell, causing now more of a positive charge on the inside, where the potassium are going to come out, causing a more negative. So you've changed the charges, okay? All right, so the reversal of this charge is called an action potential. That is moving the impulse across this neuron, okay? Action potential. So know that term. Action potential is very important because that's where basically you have your nerve impulse. The reversal of those charges in the cell membrane is the action potential, and it allows that nerve impulse to move across that, that neuron, okay? As the impulse passes, though, the resting potential is restored, and a negative charge is now on the inside of the cell, and a positive charge is now on the outside of the cell. So as that neuron, or as that nerve impulse moves along that neuron, okay, you have the changing of the voltage, but then as it passes, it goes back to normal, okay? That's restoring the resting potential, okay? So here's an example of the sodium-potassium pump. So here's a cell membrane, that typical phospholipid bilayer that you see here. And you have, these sodium out here, potassium here, and basically in order to get the charges to switch, you have this pump, okay, and it pumps these in the opposite direction. So here's another picture of what that nerve impulse looks like. So here's the cell membrane in the neuron, okay, you have positive on the outside and negative on the inside. All of a sudden this nerve impulse comes through. So that's when you have the sodium ions that leak in and cause a positive charge. See, now that nerve impulse is going to start to move along that cell membrane, and then as it moves along, the potassium ions are going to leak back out and cause that resting potential to come back. So it's going to be positive on the outside, negative on the inside again. So it's going to return that to its resting potential. Okay. So again, I know that's a lot of details, and you guys might be like, "What did she just talk about? Are you kidding me?" But just kind of take that all in. Again, I'm not going to be testing you on that, but you'll hear that again in college. The threshold, though, know this term. The threshold is the strength. It's not. Let me go back. Let's talk about the threshold. The strength of an impulse is always the same. You're not going to have a stronger impulse with its stronger wind outside. So basically, if you have a nice tiny breeze versus a powerful wind, it's going to be the same stimulus. It's not that something that's more powerful is going to give you a more powerful stimulus, okay? It sends a signal to the brain, and all stimuluses are always the same. Either there's an impulse in response to that stimulus or there's not. So either you feel that wind or you don't, okay? The minimum level of a stimulus that's required to activate the neuron and cause that signal to be transferred through the neuron is called a threshold. So basically, you have to reach that threshold. Take, for instance, someone takes a little feather and you're not looking, and they're rubbing it along your, just barely even touching, hardly even touching your skin, and you don't feel it, okay? You haven't reached that threshold. Then all of a sudden, you feel tiny little tickle on your hairs. All of a sudden, that threshold has been met, and now you have a nerve impulse, and your brain is saying, I feel something, okay? So you have to reach that threshold. All or nothing. It's also called the all or nothing effect, okay? So either you are stimulated or you're not. All right, the synapse. I feel like this is just a never-ending system. There's so much to talk about. The synapse is the location at which a neuron can transfer an impulse to either another neuron or an effector organ, okay, so an organ or gland, so to speak, okay. Neurotransmitters are chemicals that are used by a neuron to transmit the impulse across this little gap called the synapse to another cell. So at the end of a neuron, you have something called the axon terminal, okay? And this axon terminal is kind of the end of that neuron. Well, there's a little gap called the synapse between either the next neuron or the organ that it's going to affect, okay? So in order to get this impulse across this space, you have these chemicals called neurotransmitters. So they come down to the axon terminal. As that impulse comes down this way, it causes these neurotransmitters to be released, and this is called the synaptic cleft, okay? And it basically jumps that little gap, okay? And then it goes into these receptors, and then it transmits the impulse through that, either that next neuron or that muscle, okay? So when an impulse arrives at an axon terminal, the sacs are released with the neurotransmitters, which causes the stimulation of that second cell, okay? So there's the synapse for you. The brain, okay, again, I could talk forever and ever about the brain, but I'm going to go kind of quick through this. It's made up of two hemispheres, okay? You have the right and the left hemisphere. You also have multiple lobes, okay? So you have the frontal lobe here, it's showing that. You have the parietal lobe, up here. You have the temporal lobe in green. You have the occipital lobe, okay? All these different lobes are, you basically have all these different ways to kind of divvy up the brain so that you know kind of, it's so specific what each part does. It gives everybody a better idea of, what happens where when you have all these different kind of names for the things, okay? So here's how you can see it, the two hemispheres, okay? The right and the left hemisphere and all the different lobes here. All right, so your brain is totally amazing. This is just one little brief picture that shows a little thing, a couple of little things that your brain does. For instance, right here, this particular area right here is called the Broca's area, and it's responsible for your speech. So if you were to, get any kind of brain damage right in that area, you might lose your speech. You might have kind of some kind of crazy mumble jumble because this is your speech area. Right here's where you process hearing. This one's smell. All of these different things, visual recognition, awareness and memory right here, emotion and behavior. So it's very interesting that just different parts of your brain are responsible for different things. And back in the day, they figured a lot of this out by basically having somebody open up their skull, nothing there but brain. They're totally alive, and basically pricking little different areas of the brain to see what's stimulated. And they prick an area, and all of a sudden they start crying. Well, maybe they poked this area where emotional and behavior is kind of housed, okay? So, anyways, again, I could keep going, but if you guys have questions, specific questions, never hesitate to tell me, because there's lots of things that I can talk about with this, but I just don't have time. So made up of two hemispheres and multiple lobes. The brain consists of about 100 billion neurons. Again, those interneurons. The interneurons are the ones that are in the brain. 100 billion. Can you even imagine that? The average adult brain weighs about 3.5 pounds. Brain size is not the determinant of basically brain power or how smart you are. Remember I told you the more knowledge you have, the more dendrites you have, okay? So I thought this was kind of funny too. Not only does it have to do with the amount of dendrites on each neuron, also folds, okay? Now this is not a great picture, but it's the only one I could find. But notice these are different brains from different animals, okay? Frog, turtle, I can't read all of them, opossum, I cannot even read that, cat, and chimp, and us. So it's interesting that you look at whatever that is. Man, maybe it's a rabbit. But basically, look at how little folds you have in a cat and an opossum and a rabbit, if that's what that is. Okay, those are not very intelligent animals. But then you get to a chimpanzee, which almost looks like our human brain. But the more folds you have, basically, is what shows, kind of how intelligent an organism is, okay? And then it's kind of interesting, too, to look at a picture of a baby as it progresses in the womb, okay? So here you have 3 weeks, 7 weeks. Here's the brain has already developed, or the brain's already started to come into play here in 3 weeks. And then at 7 weeks, I believe, here's the brain, not very many folds, right? Here's nice smooth brain at 9 weeks, and then at birth already you've started to basically have these creases, and then as you get to be an adult you have more and more because of all the stuff that you've learned, right? Okay, meninges. If you guys have ever heard of meningitis, remember itis, inflammation of. You guys have to remember that. Anytime you hear itis, that's inflammation of. Tendinitis, meningitis. So meningitis is the inflammation of the meninges, and it can be very serious. But the meninges are 3 layers that protect and surround the brain. Okay, you have the dura mater, the arachnoid, and the pia mater. So these tiny little membranes are the meninges. The meninges also exist on the spinal cord as well. Okay, they cover and protect the central nervous system. They protect blood vessels, and they contain cerebral spinal fluid. Okay, if you get any kind of a viral or bacterial infection within those meninges, it's pretty serious, you know, because obviously it's protecting something really vital. So some of those can be life-threatening. All right. Physical features of the brain. The gyri are the elevated ridges of the tissue, where the sulci are those shallow grooves. Okay, so there are names for these specific features of the brain. So gyri and sulci. Okay, also known as gray matter, the gyri, and white matter. Okay. Let's talk a little bit about the cerebrum. The cerebrum is kind of this pink area right here, kind of the largest portion of the brain. It's the largest part, 83% of the brain mass. It's divided into 2 hemispheres. The left side controls the right side of the body and vice versa, which many of you guys have heard of before. That anytime if you had some kind of a brain injury to the right side of your brain, the left side of your body would be affected, and then obviously the opposite. So the cerebrum affects language, mathematics, logical thinking, musical, artistic ability, and emotions. That's a lot, right? It covers a lot. Also, the cerebrum interprets input from senses, controls movement of skeletal muscles, all that stuff. So the right side controls the left and associated with creativity and artistic ability, which some of you guys have heard that before. If you're more right-brained, you're more the creative type. If you're more left-brained, controls the right side of the body and associated with math, speech, writing, and logical thinking. I don't know, something tells me I fall right in between because, I don't know, I'm kind of creative, but also I'm kind of good at math. I don't know. You can be a little bit more, you can be a little bit of both, but you typically have a little bit more of one side than the other. The cerebellum, this lovely brown area, also obviously all of these are very important parts of the brain. The importance and function located below the occipital lobe of the cerebrum. It controls balance, coordination, and helps posture by providing muscle tone, okay? So it's really important because obviously if you don't have balance, you're not able to walk. So if there's any kind of trauma to the cerebellum, you typically aren't able to have that balance and coordination, okay? It only consists of 11% of the brain mass, but that doesn't really matter, right? Still important. Okay, the brainstem, right down here, composed of the pons, and my favorite term, the medulla oblongata, and it controls body's involuntary actions. So the brainstem, if you sever the brainstem, like maybe you're in a car accident and you sever your brainstem, you cannot live because your body's involuntary actions are those actions that, you know, allow us to breathe and our heart to beat, okay? So it's a very vital part of the brain, like everything is, but this is one part that if it was severed or there's any trauma to it, you might not survive. Okay, so the medulla oblongata is located between the pons and the brainstem. Here's the pons right here, and the brainstem's down here. So here's the medulla oblongata, the most inferior part of the brainstem. So a crucial role as the autonomic reflex center involved in maintaining body homeostasis. What that means is autonomic means all the things that happen on its own, okay? So the cardiovascular center, so the force and the rate of the heart contraction, regulates blood pressure, so obviously that's pretty important. The respiratory center controls the rate and depth of breathing and the rhythm, and other centers such as vomiting, hiccuping, swallowing, coughing, and sneezing. So obviously those things aren't that important, but these two, we kind of need those, right? All right, the forebrain. The forebrain consists of the cerebrum, thalamus, and hypothalamus, okay? So right here you can see the thalamus in pinkish red right here, and then the hypothalamus in blue. Okay, this is where sensory information is processed. Memories are also stored here. Conscious self is generated, and info is integrated and processed here. So these are some interesting inner parts of the brain that are very important. Okay, So, that is it for the nervous system. Again, I could talk and talk and talk and talk about the nervous system because there's so much to talk about the brain. But hopefully, maybe you guys will take an anatomy class because that's where you'll really discuss all of this stuff in depth, okay? All right, that's it for now.